Senator Mark Warner co-authored the original bill that calls for winding down the GSEs. Consumer advocate Ralph Nader owns shares in Fannie and Freddie common stock. We're going to hear from him in just a moment. But first, let's bring in the senator. Senator, good to have you on the halftime show.
Hey, Scott, thanks for having me on.
Why not let Fannie and Freddie recapitalize and recover?
Well, Scott, let's step back for a second. You know, 4 or 5 years ago, these entities were going down the tubes. The taxpayer stepped in for $188 billion. Yes, they've recovered, but we had a system that was not just sustainable. We were unsure whether there was an explicit government guarantee. The guarantee was at the entity, not at the securities. You had private shareholder gain, but when stuff hits the fan, taxpayer losses. That is not a sustainable system. And you've got many in Congress who want to get the government completely out of the housing marketplace that would completely destroy the 30-year fixed and cause great disruption. We come with a bipartisan proposal. We started with 10 senators, 5 Ds, 5 Rs. Now we've got the chair and the ranking member who've accepted the framework we've laid out. We've had 10 separate hearings on this. Everybody from the actual housing industry has roughly on a 1 to 10 scale given our proposal an 8 to 9, and we heard nothing in the 10 hearings we had on this subject that didn't say we were headed in the right direction. Yes, we say there ought to be more private capital up front. We maintain the 30-year fix because there is an explicit government guarantee. We maintain the funding for first-time home buyers and low-income home buyers with a defined auditable system.
Right.
You know, I think this is something that actually we may surprise some folks. This is common sense. Let's get this last piece of the financial reform system in place.
Right.
And yes, I understand that there's been some volatility in the market. I would remind the viewers, though, these shares, since they were basically worthless, have gone up, I think, 1,600% on something that is going to be litigated in the court.
Sure.
They took a hit yesterday, but most of the folks who invested early are still looking at massive profits.
They are, but then they would make the argument with respect, Senator, that there are more profits likely to be made if these things are allowed to be recapitalized. I should tell you. Let me finish, if you don't mind, Senator. Let me just let me make another point. Ralph Nader is going to follow you, and he would say, what's the difference between Fannie, Freddie, AIG, and Citi? They were allowed to get back. They were bailed out. They were allowed to get back on their feet. Shareholders were allowed to reap the rewards of the recovery of those types of entities. So why not in this case?
Well, Scott, unlike the others, we ended up having to back those, and hopefully what we've done in Dodd-Frank is make sure that we've got a resolution ability to never do that again. The difference in Fannie and Freddie is you got that government guarantee. You know, what I don't hear from some of the critics who are, I understand they got a financial interest that they want to make money on. That's American capitalism. Have at it. Go at that litigation. But you've got an explicit government guarantee. Are you going to continue a system that has private shareholder gain and public shareholder loss when we go through a dip? Are these new entities going to be recapitalized as for-profit entities, not-for-profit entities? Are they going to be the securitization done and the backstop at the entity level, at the security level? And quite honestly, I think the system that was set up with this kind of quasi-duopoly was flawed from the outset. It was remarkable it lasted as long as it did. These guys, from Mr. Nader to the hedge fund guys, they ought to have their day in court. There's a real question about the Treasury sweeping of all the profits.
Sure, and I mean,
that will be a day in court. But from a policy perspective, anybody that thinks that the status quo is viable when you've got enormous pressures to completely move the government out of housing, I think doesn't have a connection to the policy and political reality we live with right now.
To your point, Senator, Bruce Berkowitz of Fairholme is one of the hedge fund investors. I'm sure you're familiar with him and his proposal here. He sends a statement to me that says the following, and I'd like your reaction to it if you would oblige. What happened before 2008 was the result of regulatory and management failures accelerated by political meddling, he says. These failures continue today with the unlawful depletion of the entity's capital in conservatorship. Privately owned Fannie and Freddie are irreplaceable. All the sincere effort expended by the Senate Banking Committee simply confirms that there is no better alternative. Your response?
I think he has obviously not followed the 10 hearings that, with the exception, I believe, of his testimony, uniformly thought the framework in Corker Warner was the right way to go. Let's put more private capital at risk. Let's make sure we are explicit about the government backstop. Let's charge for it in a way. Let's make sure we've got the public policy goals rather than the kind of nebulous approach we've got right now. And I understand why folks don't want to change the status quo. The folks who've got the current status quo, we have virtually no private capital. It's a totally socialized government-supported system.
Sure, but the hedge funds are making the argument that a system with private capital on the hook, in part theirs, is the way to go. Maybe the first 10 to 12% of losses would be absorbed by the investors themselves.
And Scott, actually, I'm glad you raised that point, because that's exactly what we say. Private capital does a much better job than the government of pricing both interest rate risk and credit risk. Let's let Bruce and the others set up these, in effect, bond guarantors, 10% private capital, first dollar loss, before we hit the FDIC-type reinsurance fund. Yeah, they got to roll the plate in a new system. But in a system right now where there's only private side upside and downside is absorbed by the public is, I don't think passes the smell test. I'd also say, for those who say, well, look, Fannie and Freddie's made their money back. I was in the venture capital business a lot longer than I've been an elected official. If I put $188 billion to work in the bottom of the crisis, I got to tell you, as an investor, I'd want more than a 1-to-1 return.
Yeah, well, I know that.
What beyond that will be, obviously, Bruce and the others will have a case in front of the courts. That ought to be litigated. They'll have their day in court. But that should not slow the reform of a current policy that everybody across the industry knows and believes is unsustainable.
Right. No, look, I know, and I hear from these shareholders who say, they're willing to provide the new capital to a private market solution if they're allowed to do so. I got to run, Senator.
But Scott, that is what our bill does. I actually believe that these guys ought to read the bill.
I know. Let me ask you quickly, and this is my last question. I really got to run. Can this pass Congress, yes or no?
I think it will. Because if there's ever a chance, when you got bipartisan support, wide-based industry and advocate support, if not, this system's more broken than I thought.
Senator, thanks so much for spending time with us today. Important topic.